In speaking of history, what we want to do is ask ourselves, what is the most fundamental question that we're looking at when we study history? We're not just looking for whatever happened in the past, like when my daughter went to high school and found out that what they thought was history was the front page, and especially the front sports page. And so when she had had 2/3 of her class on sports for 2 weeks, she wrote a letter to the teacher and said, I'm going to take history at home. So, okay, so it isn't really sports, but what is it? And the answer is that the most fundamental question that we need to ask is, what is culture? Because the study of history is the study of what makes culture, what builds culture, what is successful in taking care of culture. And we can talk about 5 areas that are really important, and I mentioned them last month. First of all, what is the status of the individual? What does a group of people think about the dignity of the individual human person? That's the first question. The second question is, what about the family? What is the status of the family in a given group of people? Because that's going to tell you important things about what's possible in that group. The third and fourth things are science and literacy. Science is, what kind of an attitude does this group of people have towards understanding the natural world and telling people what they understand? What is the attitude towards literacy? First of all, how many people can read in a given culture? That's the first question. But what's the attitude about letting more people learn to read? That's fundamental. And then the fifth issue of culture is providence. And there are 2 sides to providence. One is just, how do we see God specifically entering into history? And secondly, who are the saints or the holy people? So in just an hour or less, I can't do all of history, but I'd like to talk about history from the beginning up until now, talk about some individual people, and just give you an idea of what it is that I have in mind to keep in mind when you're studying. You know, as I was preparing for this talk, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal, and it was a quotation. It began with that wonderful quotation where Reagan is standing at the Brandenburg Gate, and he says, Mr. Gorbachev, come to this gate. If you want prosperity in your country, come to this gate and tear down this wall. So the author of the article says that she was delighted to find that the AP history exam that's put together for all the people who might want to clap out of history in college includes this quotation and a multiple choice question about it. But the multiple choice question, you know, you can look at these and figure out what the answer is. And the answer is that this is an example of American belligerence and warmongering in the late 20th century. Well, so that's where history is among the seculars. If it's taught at all, it's taught in a way that is just the complete reverse of what it is that we want to say. And, you know, as I was preparing this also, I was thinking, okay, if anybody finds out what my qualifications are for giving this talk, what will they do? But we are dealing with a situation where people who have no qualifications at all have a specific narrative about history. And in that narrative, the individual doesn't matter. The family is completely relative. Science is how we have destroyed the world. Literacy is irrelevant. And providence, what's there to say about providence? We don't talk about God. So there is a narrative out there. And if we sit back and humbly say, well, I'm not going to say that I have a historical narrative until I have a PhD, it's not going to happen. So here's my narrative. First of all, in the earliest human life that we know about, the thing that we know is that people were curious. Oh my goodness, people got all the way to America. Apparently 10 or 20 or maybe even more, thousands of years ago. That means that either they came out of Africa, that's where it started. They came up out of Africa through Ethiopia. Then they had to go all the way across either the southern area and cross the Polynesian islands and then somehow leap from the Polynesian islands to South America, or they had to go all the way up through China and along the Kamchatka Peninsula and then come down that way, or else they had to go straight across the water. 10,000, 20,000 years ago, how did they do that? But here's how they did it. We all have sons, and among those sons, there's one who says, what's behind the next mountain? What's behind the next, there's one who tells us this is the way it happened. There were a couple of young men who said, we have to know the next thing. We have to know the next thing. We have to know the next. And it happened. So the first thing about human beings is that element of curiosity is always there, and it's there in an individual person. There's never a community that says, let's go see what's beyond the next mountain, because in the community, there's an old woman who can't walk, there's a scared woman who doesn't want to go anywhere, there's a newborn baby who's too hard to carry. Stuff happens. But there's always a couple of young men, and they take whoever will come, and they do what curiosity tells them to do. So that's the first thing. The second thing, of course, after quite a long time, but somewhere between 13,000 years ago and 10,000 years ago, rice was domesticated in China, and around 10,000 years ago or so, wheat was domesticated somewhere in the area of Turkey. The thinking now, which I think makes sense, is that the domestication took place under what is now water. That is to say, in the area of the Black Sea, which at that time was a freshwater lake, much smaller, and they were living on the edge of that lake because it was a wonderful place to live. So everybody who talks about the domestication of wheat chooses a different area, and they're all in the neighborhood of the Black Sea, and it was only when somebody said, yes, but the Black Sea wasn't always salty. It was a freshwater lake. That then somebody else said, oh, that works. So, but anyway, once again, I just want to say, there are some gradual things that would obviously happen if you were living beside a freshwater lake and bringing your the best grains that you could down from where they're growing wild up in the Anatolian highlands. You can bring them down, and some of the seeds will fall on the ground, and maybe they'll sprout, and maybe you'll figure out, well, we could plant here and that kind of stuff. So you can make it sound as if the whole thing would happen accidentally. But here's the thing. It didn't happen accidentally in 25 different places. It only happened here. And apparently something similar happened in China, but what happened in China was so much before that it's not certain that it didn't go from one place to the other. In other words, we're not sure that it was even discovered twice. The idea of farming, the idea of domesticating, the idea of saving seed and specifically planting it. But it was discovered, and so then you have a change in nutrition and you have a change in civilization. Here's why you have a change in civilization. As long as you just are taking care of goats and you're wandering around with your goats through the mountains, you never have a city. And there's things that don't happen until you have a city. You don't have pottery until you have a city. You don't really have very much basket weaving. You could have a little bit, and you don't have money until you have a city. But what a city requires is that somewhere in the country, somebody be able to grow much more food than he needs for his family so that he can bring it to the city and give it to you. You can't have a farm in the city. You can have a little tiny garden, but that's all. So that change, that domestication of grains, changed the possibility of having a city. And that's a complete change in life. Now, here's what's interesting about that. Money permits slavery. If you're just all out taking care of your goats and you decide you want to make somebody a slave, you got to hold on tight, because in the first place you have to move with your goats, and once you got everybody all unhitched, that one can just take off. It's very difficult to have slavery when you're close to subsistence and when you yourself are moving around. But once you have a city, and once you have commerce, and once you have money, sooner or later the day comes when one of your neighbors, through imprudence or accidents or life, runs out of money. You lend them money, And then there's the question of how they're going to pay you back. And they may do it promptly, and they may take a long time or a short time, and you can charge interest. And here's what's interesting. When we discuss usury, the Jewish people, I believe alone of the ancient peoples, had strict laws against usury, against how much you could charge for the use of money. And they not only that, but they had jubilee years when you just had to say, okay, wipe the slate clean, go free. It was not permitted that you enslave another family generation after generation because you had money and they didn't. There had to be a time when things sort of equalized out. That's a tremendous change in civilization. And it took place first among the Jewish people, and then from them it came into Christianity. So it's exciting, and it's important to think about, because the dignity of the human person and the stability of the family depend on not having to deal with slavery. Because when you deal with slavery, you're not able to say, I'll work hard because by working hard, I'll have something for my children. Believe me, there are two motivations in life that are extremely powerful, and everything else is less powerful. One is God, only for people who know him, and the other is your own children. People will work their tails off for their children that they won't for anybody else until they get holy. Even for things like power and money and pleasure, people will work for a while. And maybe some people will work for a long time if they're really motivated. But the bottom line is, for a civilization as a whole, you have to get rid of slavery. You have to set up a situation where when a man works, his children benefit. And that's what the laws of usury are actually about. It's not a question of whether you lend your money at 4% or 12% or 20%, because there are market forces that dictate kind of what's possible for a bank to survive. But the fundamental thing is, if money is being used for enslavement, then it is being used in an anti-cultural manner. And when you turn it around that way and really build on first principles, you can see it much more clearly. So then after Abraham, and the Jews had their whole life, which went on for 2,000 years. He's about 2,000 years BC. But I want to talk a little bit about India and about Greece. Now, in Greece, we know that there were philosophers, talked about many different things, and they were critical in their thinking. They thought about logic. They talked through how the universe must be put together. They critiqued the ideas of their mythology as being not really a God that would take your whole loyalty. So they had an intellectual life that was vibrant and that is still part of our culture. They didn't really have certainly a mystical spirituality. They had, you see in Socrates and in other people, a depth of commitment of the heart, but you don't see a relationship with God as Father or as a person or as a friend. So that's interesting. When we go to India, we have just the opposite situation. In India, there are a lot of teachings in the Indian scriptures, which are touted now, especially in the New Age, as being oldest scriptures in the world, and this is the oldest religion in the world, and isn't that great, and don't you want to be a part of it? And then you feel like you're really in the biggest movement that there ever was. Keep in mind that Hinduism sponsored the caste system. The caste system is contrary to the dignity of the human person. It's contrary to the dignity, of course, of the untouchables. That's pretty insulting. But it's also contradiction of the dignity of everybody else, because you're judging people, first of all, by their family. And you're not saying, here I am, I'm with you, I have a relationship with you. There's always this other thing intervening. There's a lovely story about Mother Teresa of Calcutta, who was on the steps, she had one of her houses for the dying near the steps of one of the Hindu temples. And there was a commotion on the steps one day, and she went up to see what it was, and somebody was dying, so of course what his mother runs and picks him up. Why didn't anybody else pick him up? Because he was a Brahmin. And if you're a Brahmin, only a Brahmin can pick you up. And nobody else was around was a Brahmin, but even if they had been, the Brahmins can't touch anybody who's dead, and he was dying. So what if a Brahmin picks him up and he dies? Then the Brahmin has touched a dead body, so nobody picked him up. So she went and picked him up. And he lived, and he said to her, all of my life I've worshipped the goddess in this temple, but now I have seen the goddess in flesh and blood. And that is the fundamental critique of Hinduism, that they have all of these ideas about nearness to God. But the nearness to God is always the nearness of a drop that falls into the sea and dissolves. It's not the nearness of a personal relationship. And so the dignity of the human person is not really built up by such a religion. Of course, to a certain degree it is. Anybody who engages in any kind of an inner life grows in their inward dignity. That is, of course, true. And there are passages in the Hindu scriptures that are very, very beautiful and lovely. But then there are other passages always talking about the drop being lost in the sea. And there are passages which talk about the world in a manner that suggests everything is one, and that the kinds of distinctions that you make when you begin to pursue the natural sciences are really kind of alien to this way of thinking. So we have the Greeks on the one hand doing wonderful things with civilization, and we have the Hindus on the other hand doing other things. And one of the most interesting moments in Indian history from this perspective is in the neighborhood of 200 BC, I don't remember the exact date, I hope it's not too much earlier, there was an emperor who united all of India. He was the first person. His name was Chandragupta, and he united all of India into a single empire. Of course, he did it pretty ruthlessly. And in fact, there's a book written by his, I don't know, war minister or whatever, policy minister, called the Arthasastra. And in the Arthasastra, he describes things like, well, if you want to take over another town and incorporate it, what you need to do is send spies into the town and find out what people quarrel about in that town. And what you need to do is build up the quarrels and strengthen them until they're all really mad at each other. See if you can get them fighting and weaken themselves, and then go in and take over. Well, okay. I mean, it worked. So, but do you see how insulting that is to the human person and how contrary to the idea of culture? Well, anyway, he built up this empire, and he had, I think it's his son, it might be his grandson, was named Ashoka. And Ashoka was converted to Buddhism. First of all, Ashoka came on the throne, and he had a terrible war to win the last little piece of India that his father or grandfather hadn't acquired. And the blood horrified him, and he swore that he would never engage in that kind of war again. And so he either became a Buddhist right before and was horrified, or he became a Buddhist afterwards. But he became a Buddhist, and then his commitment was everybody is equal. That's the step forward in Buddhism. Buddhism does not actually envision a personal God. In that sense, it's not a religion. It's a spiritual discipline of kindness and stuff. But everybody is equal. And that step forward in human dignity made him undertake many works of mercy. One of them was the first rest stops for travelers. He chose places where people would need to travel across the desert, and he planted banyan trees so that they would have shade, and he planted some kind of fruit trees so that they would have food, and he dug wells so that they would have water, which is, of course, the principal essential. And India, you know, it has the Ganges River flowing east and the Indus River flowing west, and in between them, you know, only rich people can travel from one to the other because you need water to travel. And this is what he took care of. So you see a complete change because he adopted a different religious way of thinking. Of course, Hinduism had its priesthood. Buddhism, which was born in India, was completely wiped out of India. When Westerners found Buddhism, it was found in China. It was assumed that it was a Chinese religion, and it was only after some time, and because Ashoka had actually built some temples to the Buddha, that it was discovered that no, Buddhism actually came from India, but it was wiped out. But anyway, there was a thought there, and there was a sign of what it means to have a real idea of the dignity of the human person, how it can completely change a culture. So then we come to the life of Jesus. And the life of Jesus is short and small in many ways, but the theology is enormous. We are saying that the second person of the Trinity became man. And John ends his gospel in this incredible way about, we're talking about something we have seen and touched. The word of life, but we've touched it with our hands. And that is an idea that would never arise within either Hinduism or Buddhism. It's all spiritual, it's all invisible, it's all about the drop falling into the sea. It's not about, I have a hand, and in my hand I can touch something of infinite value. So when Jesus comes, for the first time, you have an idea of the dignity of the human person in his body. And that changes your attitude towards the natural world. Because now we go back to the Greeks who are talking about the natural world, and we say, this Jesus, who has a body, is the son of the creator of the universe. So now we have a whole different attitude towards the whole of material creation. And how does that play out? In the beginning, it's hard to see how it plays out. There's a couple hundred years of persecution, and the only thing that we really see happening, and of course, how clearly do we see it? Because who looks? There are a bunch of heresies and arguments about the meaning of the incarnation. And people talk about them when they haven't done theology as being, well, theologians think about stuff like that, but anyway, I just love Jesus. No. The reason why there are still people on earth who believe that God became man is because the theologians beat out this question. Can God become man? What does it mean? Are there really two people? Does he just look like a man, or did he really become man? All those questions had to be worked out. But they were worked out little by little. And in the 6th century, something very interesting happened. In Spain, there was a bishop who was a good, thoughtful bishop. And he had a younger brother who, I don't exactly know why, whether there was a mother who died and another mother who came in. But anyway, he had a younger brother who was 25 years younger. And by gosh, Leander made sure that his little brother Isidore was well educated. So Isidore grew up educated. And if you know anything about education, I mean, we all do. We're homeschooling moms mostly, and it's very demanding. We just wish we had had a better background. Well, Isidore saw that. And so what he did was he began to write books. He wrote books about grammar, logic, and rhetoric. He wrote books about shipbuilding, and he wrote books about everything in between. He wrote 20 different books. Then he called together all of by this time he had become a bishop, and eventually his older brother died. But anyway, he called the bishops together and he said, we need to build a cathedral school in every place there's a bishop. And there will need to be a curriculum. Here are the books. And that, he's called the schoolmaster of the Middle Ages. His books were copied for 1,000 years. And when the printing press was started, they were printed several times. I mean, other people wrote books, but Isidore of Seville was the schoolmaster of the Middle Ages. And he wasn't particular. And so all of these schools were founded all over Spain. Okay, this is the 6th century. and the 7th century. And the idea went up to England and they began to do stuff. At the same time, Islam began. So Islam was founded, and Leander's schools, and Leander and Isidore's schools were growing in Spain. And Islam was not founded on the incarnation. It really requires a denial of the incarnation. And in fact, when Islam swept around such a large part of Western culture, what it really swept up most strongly was the places that were Arian and Nestorian, because the Arians and the Nestorians weren't really that clear about the divinity of Jesus. And if Jesus isn't really divine, then who cares whether Muhammad's a prophet or not? I mean, whatever. You don't want your head cut off, and why would you try to keep it on for something that isn't clear to you? A value, a teaching that isn't clear. But the Muslims grew, and they were warlike, and they spread. And in the meantime, Isidore's ideas spread to St. Bede in England, and then they were passed down. But England was facing another problem. And this is what I want to say, just economically, about Christianity. When somebody has a new idea, he has a new opportunity to make money. And that's what's likely to happen. So what happens next? Once you know you can make money, you can either say, good, now I can be rich and enslave you. Or you can say, I have something for the community, and we can do something, and by the way, 10% goes to the church to make it beautiful, and everybody goes into the church and enjoys that beauty. You know, it's not like building a palace. You can compare it to building a palace, but the difference is only the king goes in the palace. When you build a cathedral, every single person in town is fully permitted to go in there on the biggest feast wearing whatever clothes they have, whatever. So it's a whole different enterprise and a whole different way of approaching the human person. So in England, there was a lot of creativity, there was a lot of growth, there was a lot of wealth, and every time things started getting wealthy somewhere, the Vikings would sweep down and burn the monastery and carry off the gold and take away the grain, and everybody would hide in the woods, and when the Vikings went away, they'd come back out of the woods, you know, and pick up the pieces best they could and start rebuilding. And this went on so much that it's one of the reasons why it was maybe easy for Charlemagne to draft Alcuin to come work in Europe, because England was a discouraging place to try to build culture, but they were doing it. So Alcuin in the 780 or whatever, 790, was drafted by Charlemagne to come in to Charlemagne's palace. And here's what he was asked to do. He was asked, first of all, to run a school which would be for everybody's children in the entire palace, from the cook to Charlemagne himself, and his legitimate children and his other children, because there were plenty of both. So in other words, it was for boys and girls of every station in life, all to learn how to read. Then the second thing Alcuin was supposed to do was to get cathedral schools going throughout the kingdom. And we're talking about Charlemagne's kingdom, we're talking about Europe, basically. So now the idea of education for everyone, boys and girls, everywhere in the kingdom is there. Of course, it doesn't immediately happen. I mean, Europe at that time was a very difficult place to live. No cell phones. But nevertheless, this project of literacy for everyone went forward. And just to jump ahead of our story, but it's important to really understand this, those cathedral schools were the beginning of what became a few hundred years later the universities. Because what happens? You have a school, and then you have somebody who teaches in the school who's really famous, and the school becomes more and more famous, and more other good teachers come, and pretty soon you have a real center of culture and learning. So, you know, when St. Thomas Aquinas and St. Bonaventure were at the Sorbonne, that's really what it amounts to, the University of Paris, it's because of Charlemagne, which is because of Alcuin, which is because of Bede, which is because of Leander and Isidore. So this thing actually is a movement that happened because of the dynamic of the Christian teaching about the dignity of the human person. That is what motivates people to increase literacy. When you want to dominate people, what you want to do is decrease literacy. When you want to free people, what you want to do is increase literacy. So that was a very interesting episode. I want to say, give just one brief story that's around the 10th century, just because it's another window into what it means to be a Catholic in a way that we can appreciate, but don't necessarily think it was going on then. There was a woman named Alice of Montbar, and she married the local king, but not of a very big place, and I don't remember his name. And they had a bunch of sons, and they also had at least one daughter. And unlike the other wealthy women of her time, she did not want a wet nurse for her babies. Now, I thought everybody until the last 100 years was nursing their own babies. No, the wealthy women had somebody else nurse their babies because that's kind of a nuisance and somebody else can do it. Somebody low class who hasn't got anything better to do. No, Alice of Montbar said, I am going to nurse my own children because I think they get a lot more than milk from whoever nurses them. And that is also true. Okay, so who were her sons? Well, it's St. Bernard of Clairvaux and the 6 brothers who went with him to renew monasticism at that moment in history when the need was so great. And he grew up with this mother who loved God and who was determined to give her sons her whole self, everything that she knew, everything that she carried in her heart. So it's a beautiful story and a reminder that at this period in history, we don't always know what the whole family situation is. But we do know that the church, right from the beginning, had teachings against divorce and against abortion, and these things which tear the family apart and which tear the heart of a woman apart were all forbidden within Catholic Christianity. So that's how monasticism was renewed. Now, let's see, a little bit, well, actually it's a little bit before Bernard, but anyway, I want to tell you a little bit about the King of England called Edward the Confessor. Once again, this is very interesting. If you read Wikipedia about Edward the Confessor, it's not a very uplifting story. It's kind of like, here's the kind of a dodo. He wasn't really a very good king, and he was incompetent and selfish and all that kind of stuff. But there's another side to the story, and the other side is this. Edward the Confessor lived at a moment in English history when it was possible, and probably was possible for hundreds of years, for somebody to be wealthier than the king. And wealth is power. So just because he was king of England doesn't mean he was running England. But he was the king. And the things that are apparently known about him, I mean, I just found this astounding. He had a gift of healing. King had a gift of healing? Like, why would a king have a gift of healing? People who had scrofula would come to him. Scrofula is a disease where you have these dreadful sores all over you. Which king in the ancient world, which king anywhere around would say, okay, well, if you have a horrible disease that's disgusting to look at, come and I'll touch you and you'll be healed. You can't even imagine making up a story like that outside of Christianity. But apparently they were healed. And here's the thing that took me totally by surprise and made me reevaluate everything I had heard. He built Westminster Abbey. He built it because he had made a vow that if he became king, he would make a pilgrimage. And when he became king, he looked at England and he said, if I leave this country, it's going to be very bad. In the first place, I won't be king when I come back. But in the second place, it'll just be chaotic for everybody. So he wrote to the Pope and said, what shall I do? And the Pope said, build a church. So he built Westminster Abbey. And then at some point it was demolished and rebuilt. And so his tomb, which was there, had to be moved back and forth. He's incorrupt. This King of England is incorrupt. Oh my goodness, what a surprise. So anyway, he's incorrupt. He had a gift of healing. And he even though very many bad things happened during his reign, so that people say he was a weak king, if you look at the bad things that happened, you understand that if he had fought those bad things, he would have had a very bloody reign. What he gave to the people of England was 25 years of peace. And at the end of those 25 years, there was a royal battle because the end of the 25 years is when William the Conqueror comes from France. But of course, France, a large part of France was part of the English crown at that time anyway. So it's not like he was coming from a super foreign country. He was coming from the eastern provinces. And he had a right to be on the throne, and Edward had indicated that that was his choice, but that's a very long story, and a very bloody one. But there had been 25 years of peace before that. And when William the Conqueror came in, he brought with him the new monasticism of Cluny, so that there was a reform religiously within England after him. So it's a very exciting story. Now, the next thing I want to talk about, just briefly, I just want to talk about another individual. His name is Robert Grosseteste. I wish that I had sat down and memorized all of the little parts of his life that are important, and I didn't. But what I can tell you is he was a bishop, and he was a good bishop, and he was also a scientist, and he was a good scientist. One of the things that he studied was the refraction of light, but he studied many other things. And when you look at the list of things he studied, you think, oh, wait a second, is this Newton or Grosseteste? No, it's Grosseteste. He's 300 years before Newton, and all these things that you think of as being Newton's work, he did. That doesn't mean there was nothing for Newton to do, but when Newton came along, he systematized a bunch of things. But he didn't really acknowledge where he had gotten everything. He was sort of the great plagiarizer. And one of the reasons why the idea persists that, you know, medieval times are just dark and there wasn't any learning and they never talked about anything except theology and they're all brainless, is that Newton didn't acknowledge his debt to these other people. And not only that, this is even more interesting. Newton kind of had this idea that knowledge that he had figured out was an esoteric gift. It really wasn't something for the common people. And he wasn't going to write it down because it wasn't for everybody. It was just for himself because he was so wonderful. And Robert Boyle came along and said, Newton, you've got to write this down. People need this, please. Oh, I don't want to. I'll finance it, but you've got to do it. So Robert Boyle, who had very different ideas, much more Catholic ideas, and much more Catholic sympathies actually, persuaded Newton to write things down, and he paid for the printing. And that's why they're written down. Otherwise, we'd all be reading Grosseteste still. No, we'd have passed on. But Robert Boyle did that. And the other thing that Robert Boyle did that was new was he said, when you make a record of your experiments, of course we want to know what works. But it would really be helpful also to write what didn't work. So he was the first scientist who was saying, this is what I did that failed, and this is what I did that failed, and this is what I did that failed, and this is what I did that worked. So now we have a whole different idea. Again, what we're really talking about is humility. And that, again, goes back to the dignity of the human person. Are there some people, like me, Newton, who have ideas that are so high that I don't even want to share them with you worthless untouchables? Or are we all in this together, and we're all here to serve one another? And scientific knowledge is so that we can help one another to have more joy in looking at the universe because it's so fascinating, and more convenience, really, because science always gives way afterwards to technology, and then you have an easier life for many people. So the Bishop of Lincoln, Robert Grosseteste, is a very important person. And Newton is an important person, but he's showing something very different. Not just the scientific temper, but something not quite as lovely. I've left out one person that I wanted to talk about who's very important, so we're going to have to go back. Oh no, I haven't. We're just getting there. Around the time of Robert Grosseteste is also the time of the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta, everybody remembers it. That's important because it's the beginning of, English written constitution, and isn't that great? But here's the thing about the Magna Carta that people don't always know. Of course, the barons were mad at King John because he thought, I'm the king and nobody else matters, and whatever I want, I can do. He even at one point when he was having a fight with everybody, he told the emir in Spain, that is to say, the Muslim leader in Spain, look, if you'll come and win my wars for me, I'll just make all of England become Muslims. Wouldn't that be a deal? And the emir said, no, it wouldn't be a deal. You fight your own battles. Thank heavens. But who is who is King John thinking he is, that he can just dispose of the religious life of all of his subjects? That's what's so outrageous. He's a wicked man. But so, of course, lots of barons were mad at him, and they were all, milling around saying, you need to do this, and you need to do that, and you're not being fair, and all that stuff. But, of course, his plan was, just like the Arthasastra, because it's the basic plan, was to set them fighting with each other. Just pick out three and say, you come along on my side, I'll pay you off, and blah, blah. Stephen Langton was a bishop. And because he was a bishop, he was a noble, because that's the way things were. And he said to all the other nobles, look, if we want to make progress, we need to agree on exactly what we want from the king. And we need to stand together so that he can't pick off three of us and set us fighting. We need to agree. So let's sit down. It takes a very special person to get a bunch of men into a room and get their discussion clear and say, these are the things that we're going to go for. Write them all down, make a list, and tell the king, you sign this list, period. That's what all of us want you to sign. Well, so King John signed it, and that was good. And then he did some clever things and tried to get Stephen Langton in trouble, which he more or less succeeded in doing for a while. Stephen Langton was kind of in the doghouse with the Pope, but that came to an end. Stephen Langton also wrote the sequence for the Feast of Pentecost. So when you come to the Feast of Pentecost, and there's that lovely poem in the middle of the liturgy, that's from the man who got the Magna Carta signed. This is not a man who has one little tiny idea. This is a man who is thinking about the Holy Spirit, and he's thinking about how to run a civic entity. And he also, just by the side, because, he had time, I guess, on his hands, he divided the books of the Bible into chapters. 200 years later, somebody else divided them into verses. But the chapters are from the person who got the Magna Carta signed. So the point is, within Christianity, you have people who both have a deep spiritual life, a spiritual life that a Hindu could be proud of, and at the same time, an intellectual and a civic life that a Greek could be proud of. And that's the thing that is so new in history, and you need to be watching for it the whole time. Because the narrative that's out there in the secular world is that there is no such thing as a hero. Nothing was ever achieved by a war. The family, there's all different kinds of families. If I like you and let you live in my house, we're a family. We're really a family. Isn't that really what family is? And science, as I said, it's all about destroying the natural world. I'll tell you a funny story about destroying the natural world. There's a book called, it's a history of science by somebody named Joy Hakim. And she has a volume called Newton at the Center, where she works through a period in history. And you open up the book, and within the first 5 pages, she's got this whole screed on the destruction of the forests in Europe, and how terrible that was, and how that caused. She must have said it caused global warming. She wouldn't have said it caused global cooling, but anyway, whatever it caused. It was very cold during that period, but nevertheless, they cut all the trees down, and it was terrible. And what were they cutting the trees down for, they were cutting them down to have bathhouses and to heat the water so that they could bathe. So wasn't that unspeakable of them? Well, the funniest part of it is, this is how she starts out the book, is deforestation for bathhouses. But then as you go along further and you back up in history and start picking up all the stuff that goes on, one of the things that happens is that there's this plague. And what happened with the plague? Everybody caught diseases. And why did they catch diseases? I'll tell you why. Because the Catholic Church was opposed to public baths. And if people had bathed more, they wouldn't have had the plague. And I'm going, oh really? You really think a public bathhouse is the way to avoid the plague? What a novel idea. Have you researched it? But besides that, she's talking out of both sides of her mouth about whether it was good to have bathhouses. So total incoherence. And that's what you get when you don't stop and say, what is the dignity of the human person? What is the place of a family? What is invention really for? What is the natural environment really, really, truly for? The other thing that happened at the end of the 13th century, or maybe during it, I don't remember his dates, but Genghis Khan. And I bring up Genghis Khan because once again, we're looking at a very different civic idea. And we're looking at a different family life. He grew up in Mongolia, and there was a rivalry between some different Mongolian tribes, and somebody betrayed somebody, and his dad got killed, and his mother was thrown out of the tribe, and so she had to go off in the bush and eat roots and horrible things with her children. And her life was extremely difficult. So he grew up with an angry mother, a difficult life, a missing father, and he became a vicious person, just vicious. And he gradually, they conquered one tribe, conquered another. His empire got bigger and bigger, and pretty soon, his way of training his men was to say, make a circle around this area, and move into the circle, and don't let so much as a rabbit get out alive. So it was, practicing how to totally wipe out every bit of life in an area. So they got farther and farther, and they took more and more. And his grandson was responsible for the burning of a huge library in Baghdad. The library was burned in 1258. So this is probably during the life of St. Thomas Aquinas. It's an incredible thing that the biggest library in the world at that time was this library in Baghdad. But the Mongolians didn't really think about libraries. That wasn't their deal. And the river ran with first blood, of course, and then ink for days and days afterwards, and thousands of people were killed. And just by way of saying, this is a concept of rulership where I can win, therefore I'm going to win, and everything else is just simply mowed down in front of me. Everything. This particular grandson of Genghis Khan was married to a Nestorian, so some of the Nestorian Christians survived his depredations. And interestingly enough, he didn't sweep all the way across Europe because it was so poor. He didn't think it was worthwhile. Thank heavens, every now and then poverty comes in handy. But just to say, this is a concept of kingship. It is common in history for there to be such a concept. And don't take it for granted that, of course, everybody wants the greatest good for the greatest number. They don't. Not at all. That is a Christian idea, and it grew up within Christianity, and it didn't really grow up very well anywhere else. There were some Buddhists who had a similar idea, and Confucius in some ways did, but again, there's both Buddhism and Christianity, both Buddhism and Confucianism, leave a person without a relationship with our Heavenly Father. So that's a complete adventure exclusive to Christianity. So I want to close. I mean, of course, I could come up to the 20th century and we can talk about America. I think that you're aware of the beauty of America. The only thing that I want to say with all of this, the rest of the history of the world, is that America was built in view of all of these other things. The foundation of the American civics was partly from Greek philosophy, partly from Roman order, and partly from the Judaic monotheism. Those were the three vast influences on what we have. There's a theory out there now that the idea of letting everybody participate in the vote is something that we got from the Iroquois Indians. Okay, whatever. The Iroquois Indians, like other people who don't have strong cities, had a sense of equality, and it did include the women. So that was good. But all the way through the Middle Ages, the dignity of women and their participation in public life grew. It was actually in the Renaissance and in the Protestant Reformation, combining with the Renaissance, that women lost their rights and lost ground and everything backed up. So I don't really want to hand everything over to the Iroquois. Christianity did think of this, and it was moving forward, and it was held up. The book to read about that is called Those Terrible Middle Ages. But anyway, the American civic government is built on an understanding of all of the history that went before. And it's vulnerable to all of the kinds of forces that hurt other stuff. But number one, it's vulnerable to ignorance. It's vulnerable to negative attitudes about the environment, the destruction of American economy by engendering and perpetrating negative ideas about science. It is something that we have to oppose on principle. We were supposed to increase and multiply and fill the earth and not destroy it, but be stewards of it. The destruction of family life, I just want to back up and say something about how my ideas on this began. South Dakota put out history standards a number of years ago. And as I was looking at them, and one of the history standards was that, we should all know what a great American hero of democracy Nelson Mandela was. And I thought, okay, Nelson Mandela, a great hero of American democracy. What is wrong with this picture? And here's the fundamental point, is that I had 200 or 250 pages of this kind of stuff. And I thought, if I go to the hearing on these South Dakota history standards and explain why this doesn't belong here, okay, good, take it out. And the whole rest of the 250 pages is there. How can I do something bigger? And I don't mean this arrogantly, but I'm just going to say it. The Lord spoke to me and he said, just look at it. Just look. So I backed away from, the little tunnel vision, and I realized that they had said that there were, at that time, 5 standards of things that people should understand in history. The individual, great. The family, great. Science and some other stuff. But when they came to the family right away, it was, right away in kindergarten, children need to understand that there are all different kinds of family life. And I thought, okay, fine, I understand it. China is the main civilization outside of Christianity that has been long and continuous in its cultural hold. It's monogamous. That is a fundamental, essential for culture, because culture passes through the mother or it doesn't pass. And if the mother is not able to take care of her children, or if she, somebody's taking care of her children, but she has to compete for their father's attention so that she doesn't give of herself, the children suffer. The family, the monogamous family, is the conduit of high culture. That is how high culture has to grow. And what we need to do is be aware of that step by step as we're teaching history. Every time there's a rip against the family, every time that there's a dismissal of an individual that we think of as great, we need to stop and say, this is destroying the dignity of every person by saying there's no such thing as a great person, there's only the socialist gathering. And only the socialist gathering, not the family. That's what we have to watch for in our history books. And every time we find it, we need to research it and counter it. Well, we don't have time for that. But you need to make sure that your kids research one or two topics carefully enough so that they can see what this prejudice is. Of course, I dream that we would have a website where we would go through the kinds of things that are in the modern, of course not textbooks, because they've thrown out the textbooks, they're going to do the whole thing online, but it doesn't matter, we can still find it. Counter these ideas one by one and teach our children what really makes culture, how culture has been made through history, and what they have to do to build culture. There's a book now called, I think it's called Faith of Our Fathers. It's by Paul Vitz, and he discusses how in the last maybe 200 years, or sometimes it's 350, he goes back sort of far sometimes, the great famous atheists had terrible fathers, almost all of them. They either had terrible fathers or their fathers died when they were very young and they never had a new great father figure. And then when he's finished with this very interesting discussion, he's a psychiatrist, he says, so then I thought, well, what about the great apologists for Christianity? And so he goes through a bunch of lives of men, not the saints, you know, not the popes, but just men who were famous for having faith. One of them is Blaise Pascal, who's also famous as a mathematician, and he's also famous as a scientist, but he's famous for his beautiful essays on religious faith. He had a darling father, that's all I can say. His father stayed home, put little Blaise in his lap, and taught him just like that. It's just a beautiful story. But what it says is family matters. This is how you build culture. And when you're a Christian, building culture doesn't just mean one little narrow path that you go down. It means the whole understanding that God is our Father, the whole understanding that the universe is beautiful, the whole understanding that everybody should have literacy and everybody should have joy, and when it's time to build a family, they should just really go after it. So that's what I have to say about history. Thank you for listening.